The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hotel parking lot as Amara Johnson pulled up in her sleek sedan. She'd been on the road for hours, eager to check in and unwind before tomorrow's important business meeting. Little did she know, her evening was about to take an unexpected and alarming turn. Amara grabbed her overnight bag and headed for the lobby, her high heels clicking purposefully against the pavement. At 32, she exuded confidence, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo. As a rising star at her law firm, Amara was used to commanding respect, but sometimes respect wasn't freely given. The front desk clerk smiled warmly as Amara approached. "Welcome to the Pinewood Inn, ma'am. How can I help you this evening?" "Reservation for Johnson," Amara replied, sliding her ID and credit card across the counter. The clerk tapped at his computer. "Of course, Ms. Johnson. I have you down for a single king room, one-night stay. Is that correct?" Amara nodded, already thinking ahead to the files she needed to review before bed. The check-in process went smoothly, and soon she was wheeling her small suitcase towards the elevator. As the doors slid open on the fourth floor, Amara noticed a pair of uniformed police officers standing near the ice machine, engaged in quiet conversation. She gave them a polite nod as she passed, but couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes following her down the hallway. Room 412. Amara swiped her keycard and pushed open the door, breathing a sigh of relief as she stepped inside. She just set down her bag when a sharp knock made her jump. "Police, open up." Amara's heart began to race. What was going on? She hadn't done anything wrong. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she approached the door. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, opening the door partway. The two policemen she'd seen earlier stood in the hallway, their expressions stern. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this room," the taller one stated. "We're going to need to come in and take a look around." Amara's legal training kicked in immediately. "I'm sorry, but I just checked in less than 5 minutes ago. There must be some mistake. Do you have a warrant?" The shorter officer's face darkened. "Listen, lady, we don't need a warrant when there's probable cause. Now step aside or we'll have to use force." Amara stood her ground, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I have rights. I'm a paying guest at this hotel, and you have no legal grounds to enter my room without my consent or a valid warrant. If there's been a complaint, I suggest you speak with hotel management to clear up any misunderstanding." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly not expecting such pushback. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe there may be illegal substances in this room. If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't object to us taking a quick look," the taller one insisted. Amara's eyes narrowed. "And what, exactly, is your reason to believe that? Because I assure you, there are no illegal substances in this room. I'm an attorney, and I know my rights. Unless you can provide specific, articulable facts supporting your suspicion, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A flicker of uncertainty passed over the officers' faces. The shorter one leaned in, lowering his voice. "Listen, we got a call about a person of interest, matching your description. Just let us take a quick look and we'll be on our way. No need to make this difficult." And there it was, the real reason behind this intrusion. Amara felt a familiar mix of anger and weariness wash over her. She'd faced this kind of prejudice before, but never so blatantly from those sworn to protect and serve. "Officers," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, "I want your names and badge numbers, right now. And I want you to call your supervising officer to this location immediately. What you're doing is a clear violation of my Fourth Amendment rights, and I intend to file a formal complaint." The officers hesitated, clearly realizing they'd miscalculated. Amara pressed on, her legal expertise shining through. "Furthermore, your actions could be construed as racial profiling, which opens up a whole other set of legal issues. I suggest you walk away now, before this situation escalates any further." A tense silence filled the hallway. Amara could see the wheels turning in the officers' minds as they weighed their options. Finally, the taller one spoke, his tone noticeably less aggressive. "Ma'am, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. We apologize for the inconvenience. Have a good evening." With that, they turned and walked briskly towards the elevator, leaving Amara standing in her doorway, heart pounding but head held high. As the adrenaline began to subside, Amara closed the door and leaned against it. Taking deep breaths, she'd stood her ground, but the encounter left her shaken. How many others had faced similar situations without the knowledge or resources to defend themselves? Amara's mind raced. This wasn't over. She couldn't let this injustice slide. Pulling out her phone, she began documenting every detail of the encounter while it was fresh in her memory. Tomorrow's business meeting suddenly seemed far less important than the new mission taking shape in her mind. Little did those officers know, they'd picked the wrong woman to intimidate. Amara Johnson was more than just a successful attorney. She was a fighter, an advocate, and a force to be reckoned with. And she was about to shine a spotlight on the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement in ways that would reverberate far beyond this hotel hallway. As Amara settled in for a long night of research and planning, one thing was certain: this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Amara's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, the soft glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She'd been up for hours, poring over legal precedents, statistics on police misconduct, and local news reports. The more she dug, the clearer it became. Her encounter wasn't an isolated incident. She paused, rubbing her tired eyes. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 3:47 a.m. In just a few hours, she was supposed to be presenting a major contract proposal to a potential client. But how could she focus on corporate law when a much bigger injustice demanded her attention? Amara reached for her phone, hesitating only a moment before dialing a familiar number. It rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Amara, it's the middle of the night. What's wrong?" "Marcus, I'm sorry to wake you," Amara said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need your help. Something happened, and I can't let it go." Marcus Taylor had been Amara's mentor since her first year of law school. Now a prominent civil rights attorney, he'd always encouraged Amara to use her legal skills to fight for change. As she recounted the events at the hotel, Amara could hear the anger building in Marcus's voice. "Those officers had absolutely no right," he fumed. "Amara, this is exactly the kind of case we need to shine a light on. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Amara nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see her. A civil rights lawsuit. "But Marcus, it's bigger than just me. We need to prove this is part of a pattern." "Agreed," Marcus said, fully awake now. "Listen, forget your meeting tomorrow. Come straight to my office. We got work to do." As Amara hung up, a mix of excitement and apprehension swirled in her stomach. She was about to step into a fight much bigger than anything she'd faced before. But if not her, then who? The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Amara took a leave of absence from her firm, throwing herself fully into building their case. She and Marcus pored over police reports, interviewed witnesses, and consulted with experts in law enforcement practices. What they uncovered was deeply troubling. The two officers who had accosted Amara, Derek Lawson and Michael Briggs, had a history of complaints against them, particularly from people of color. But time and again, internal investigations had cleared them of wrongdoing. "It's the blue wall of silence," Marcus explained grimly. "Officers protecting their own, even when they know it's wrong." Amara nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Then we need to make enough noise that they can't ignore us anymore." As they built their legal strategy, Amara found herself becoming the face of a growing movement. Local civil rights organizations rallied around her cause. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice and police reform. But with increased visibility came increased pushback. Amara's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, but also with threats and vitriol from those who saw her as an agitator or worse. One evening, as Amara left Marcus's office, she noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. The same vehicle had been there when she arrived that morning. A chill ran down her spine as she hurried to her car, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. "You're just being paranoid," she told herself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But deep down, she knew better. The deeper they dug into police misconduct, the more dangerous their work became. Amara's parents begged her to drop the case. "We're proud of you, sweetie," her mother said during one tense phone call, "but is it worth risking your career, your safety?" For a moment, Amara wavered. She thought of her comfortable apartment, her promising career path, the life she'd worked so hard to build. Was she really ready to put it all on the line? But then she remembered the fear and helplessness she'd felt that night in the hotel hallway. How many others had experienced that same fear, without the means to fight back? "I have to do this, Mom," Amara said softly. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been silenced." As the date of their first court appearance approached, the pressure intensified. Amara and Marcus worked around the clock, fine-tuning their arguments and preparing for every possible counter. The night before the hearing, Amara tossed and turned, unable to quiet her racing thoughts. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and decided to review their files one last time. She was so engrossed in her work that she almost missed the sound. A faint scratching at her front door. Amara froze, straining her ears. There it was again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. Heart pounding, Amara reached for her phone, but before she could dial 911, her apartment door burst open. Two shadowy figures rushed in, their faces obscured by masks. "Ms. Johnson," one of them growled. "We need to have a little chat about this lawsuit of yours." Amara's mind raced. Who were these men? Corrupt cops? Hired thugs? Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route or a weapon. But as the intruders advanced, Amara realized she was trapped. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd fought against, it all came down to this moment. With her back against the wall, Amara made a split-second decision. She might be outnumbered, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed, Amara prepared to face her attackers head-on. Little did she know, this confrontation would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the local justice system. But in that moment, all Amara could focus on was survival and the burning determination to see her fight through to the end, no matter the cost. Amara's heart pounded as she faced the intruders, her mind racing through self-defense moves she'd learned years ago. Just as the first man lunged forward, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The intruders hesitated, glancing back at the open door. "Police, don't move." Relief flooded through Amara as uniformed officers stormed into her apartment, weapons drawn. Intruders raised their hands, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. As the would-be attackers were cuffed and led away, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Detective Sarah Chen, her expression a mix of concern and determination, rushed to Amara's side. "Are you all right? We got an anonymous tip about a planned attack on you. I'm so glad we made it in time." Amara nodded, still shaken. "Thank you, Sarah. But how did you know?" Detective Chen had been a valuable ally in Amara and Marcus's investigation, providing crucial information at great personal risk. Now, she looked around nervously before lowering her voice. "There's a group within the department that's desperate to keep this lawsuit from going forward. They've got powerful friends, Amara. This goes deeper than just a few bad cops." As the adrenaline wore off, the implications of Sarah's words sank in. This wasn't just about two officers who'd overstepped their bounds. They were up against a systemic problem, one with roots that reached into the highest levels of local government. The next morning, as news of the attack spread, Amara found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside her building, shoving questions as she made her way to Marcus's office. "This changes everything," Marcus said gravely when Amara finished recounting the night's events. "We need to expand our lawsuit. This isn't just about police misconduct anymore. It's about corruption at every level." Amara nodded, a steely resolve settling over her. "We need to find out who's behind this, and we need to keep Sarah safe. She's risking everything to help us." As they dug deeper, a complex web of connections began to emerge. Campaign contributions from police unions to local politicians. Suspicious real estate deals involving high-ranking officers. And at the center of it all, a shadowy figure known only as the Commissioner. While Amara and Marcus built their case, support for their cause grew. Community organizers held rallies demanding police reform. Local businesses put up signs declaring justice for Amara. Even some rookie officers, disgusted by the corruption they'd witnessed, began to come forward with information. But for every step forward, it seemed their opponents pushed back twice as hard. Amara's tires were slashed. Marcus received threatening letters at his home, and Sarah Chen was suddenly transferred to a remote precinct, effectively silencing her. One evening, as Amara was working late at the office, she received an unexpected visitor. Officer Michael Briggs, one of the cops who'd confronted her at the hotel, stood nervously in the doorway. "Ms. Johnson, can I talk to you for a minute?" Amara tensed, ready to call for help. But something in Briggs's demeanor made her pause. He looked scared. "I'm listening," she said cautiously. Briggs took a deep breath. "What happened that night at the hotel? It wasn't right. We were following orders, but that's no excuse. I can't be part of this system anymore." As Briggs spoke, painting a picture of systemic racism and pressure from above to target certain communities, Amara felt a mix of anger and pity. Here was a man who'd gotten caught up in something much bigger than himself, finally finding the courage to speak out. "Why are you telling me this now?" Amara asked when he finished. Briggs met her eyes. "Because I've got proof. Recordings, documents, evidence of who's really calling the shots. But if I come forward, my family." He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. Amara understood all too well the risks involved. "We can protect you," she said firmly, "but we need that evidence." As Briggs nodded, agreeing to turn over what he knew, Amara felt a spark of hope. This could be the break they needed to blow the whole case wide open. But little did they know, the conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. Outside the office window, a figure lurked in the shadows, watching intently. As Briggs left, the mysterious observer pulled out a phone. "Boss, we got a problem." Briggs is talking. Across town, in a lavishly appointed office, a hand set down a crystal tumbler of whiskey. "Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't live to testify, won't we?" The pieces were all in place. Amara and her allies were on the verge of exposing a scandal that would rock the city to its core. But powerful forces were aligning against them, willing to go to any lengths to keep their secrets buried. As the sun set on another tension-filled day, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. The evidence they needed was within reach, but so too was the very real threat of those who would stop at nothing to silence them. With the court date looming and danger closing in from all sides, Amara steeled herself for the fight ahead. She'd started this journey seeking justice for herself, but now she carried the hopes of an entire community on her shoulders. Failure was not an option. Little did Amara know, the most challenging and dangerous part of her quest for justice was yet to come. As she prepared to face her opponents in court, unseen forces were setting in motion a plan that would test her resolve like never before. The morning of the trial dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the tense atmosphere that had settled over the city. Amara stood before her bathroom mirror, straightening her suit jacket with trembling hands. Today was the day they'd finally present their case, the culmination of months of hard work, sleepless nights, and constant fear. As she left her apartment, Amara's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Be careful, our friend hasn't checked in." Amara's stomach clenched. Officer Briggs was supposed to meet them at the courthouse with the evidence. His silence was worrying. The streets were unusually quiet as Amara made her way downtown. News of the trial had spread, and it seemed the whole city was holding its breath. As she approached the courthouse steps, Amara was struck by the sea of faces before her, community members, activists, and even some uniformed officers, all gathered to show their support. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Amara and Marcus huddled at their table, acutely aware of the empty seat where Briggs should have been. Across the aisle, a team of high-powered lawyers represented the police department, their confident smirks doing little to hide the nervous energy radiating from them. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Amara scanned the gallery. Her parents sat in the front row, worry etched on their faces. Behind them, she spotted Detective Chen, out of uniform and trying to blend in with the crowd, but there was no sign of Briggs. Marcus began his opening statement, laying out their case with passionate eloquence. He detailed the pattern of racial profiling, the abuse of power, and the systemic corruption that had allowed it all to flourish. As he spoke, Amara could see the jury leaning in, clearly moved by the evidence they gathered. But without Briggs and his promised recordings, they were still missing the crucial link, proof of direct orders from the top. As the morning wore on, Amara's anxiety grew. Where was Briggs? Had he lost his nerve, or had something more sinister happened? She was so lost in thought that she'd almost missed the commotion at the back of the courtroom. A disheveled man burst through the doors, clutching a manila envelope. It was Briggs. his face pale and his shirt stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. "I have the evidence," he shouted, stumbling forward. "I have proof of who's behind it all." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The defense lawyers leaped to their feet, objecting vehemently. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. And through it all, Briggs staggered towards Amara and Marcus, his eyes wild with fear and determination. But before he could reach them, a shot rang out. Screams filled the air as everyone ducked for cover. Amara's heart pounded as she peered over the table. Briggs lay motionless on the floor, the envelope just beyond his outstretched hand. And standing over him, gun still raised, was a face Amara recognized from countless press conferences and official photos, the police commissioner himself. Time seemed to stand still. The commissioner's eyes met Amara's, a mix of desperation and cold calculation in his gaze. In that moment, she understood the full weight of what they were up against, not just a few corrupt cops, but a system so rotten it would resort to murder in broad daylight to protect itself. As security officers tackled the commissioner, Amara's mind raced. The envelope. Whatever was inside, it was important enough to kill for. She had to get to it. But she wasn't the only one with that idea. As if in slow motion, Amara saw one of the defense lawyers lunge for the envelope. Without thinking, she vaulted over the table, her body moving on pure instinct. Amara's fingers closed around the envelope, just as a hand grasped her ankle, yanking her back. She kicked out, struggling to hold on to the precious evidence as hands grabbed at her from all sides. Through the melee, Amara locked eyes with Marcus. With one desperate heave, she flung the envelope towards him just as someone tackled her to the ground. Pain exploded in her head as it hit the floor. Through blurring vision, Amara saw Marcus catch the envelope. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever happened next, the truth would come out. As unconsciousness threatened to overtake her, Amara heard the judge's gavel banging furiously, voices shouting for order, and somewhere in the distance, the wail of approaching sirens. The courtroom faded to black, leaving Amara suspended in uncertainty. Had they done enough? Would the evidence be enough to bring down the corrupt system? And at what cost? As chaos reigned in the courtroom and the city beyond, the fate of Amara's quest for justice hung in the balance. The truth was finally within reach, but the forces of corruption weren't going down without a fight. In the coming hours, the very foundation of the city's power structure would be shaken, and Amara would face her greatest test yet. Amara's eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room coming into focus. Her head throbbed as memories of the courtroom chaos flooded back. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand on her shoulder kept her in place. "Easy there, counselor. You took quite a hit." Detective Chen's familiar voice was a welcome comfort. Amara blinked, taking in her surroundings. "Marcus? The envelope?" Sarah's expression tightened. "Marcus is safe, but Amara, things have gotten complicated." As Sarah filled her in, Amara felt a growing sense of dread. The evidence in the envelope had indeed been damning. Detailed records of payoffs, blackmail, and orchestrated cover-ups reaching the highest levels of city government. But its revelation had set off a chain reaction nobody had anticipated. The mayor, implicated in the scandal, had declared a state of emergency. Citing concerns about riots and unrest, he'd mobilized the National Guard. The streets were filled with armored vehicles, and a curfew was in effect. "They're calling it peacekeeping," Sarah said bitterly, "but it's martial law in all but name. Anyone speaking out against the police or city officials is being detained for questioning." Amara's mind raced. They'd sought to expose corruption, but instead of justice, they triggered a crackdown. "What about the trial?" she asked. Sarah shook her head, suspended indefinitely. "The official story is that outside agitators attempted to assassinate the police commissioner. They're painting you and Marcus as the ringleaders." Disbelief and anger warred within Amara. They'd been so close, only to have victory twisted into defeat. But as she absorbed the news, a new determination took hold. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We need to get this information out," Amara said, struggling to sit up. "The real story, if people knew the truth." "It's not that simple," Sarah interrupted. "They've shut down local news stations and social media is being heavily censored. Plus," she hesitated, clearly wrestling with something. "What is it?" Amara pressed. Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. There are rumors about a cleansing operation. Key witnesses disappearing, evidence going missing. I think they're trying to erase everything before the feds can get involved. The implications were chilling. This was no longer just about exposing corruption. Lives were at stake, including their own. Just then, Amara's hospital room door burst open. Marcus rushed in, his usually immaculate suit disheveled, a wild look in his eyes. We got to move. Now. Before Amara could respond, the distant sound of helicopter blades filled the air. Marcus pulled back the curtain, revealing a menacing black chopper descending on the hospital's helipad. They're here for you, he said grimly. We got about 3 minutes before they lock this place down. Adrenaline surged through Amara's system, temporarily dulling the pain in her head. With Sarah's help, she swung her legs off the bed. What's the plan? Marcus grinned, a spark of his old fire returning. Oh, you're going to love this. Remember Carlos from the community center? Turns out he has some interesting skills from his activist days. As if on cue, the lights in the hospital flickered and died. Emergency generators kicked in, bathing the corridors in an eerie red glow. In the confusion, Marcus led them through a maze of service corridors and fire exits. They emerged into the hospital's loading dock just as a nondescript van screeched to a halt before them. The side door slid open, revealing Carlos at the wheel. Get in, quick. As they piled into the van, Amara's heart raced. She'd started this journey seeking justice through the system. Now, she was fleeing that very system, branded a criminal for exposing the truth. The van peeled out of the parking lot just as armed men in tactical gear swarmed the hospital entrance. Amara watched her city blur past the windows, familiar streets now alien under the weight of military occupation. Where are we going? She asked, still trying to process the dizzying turn of events. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look. Somewhere safe, Marcus said. We got allies. Community leaders, honest cops, even some journalists who haven't been silenced yet. We're going underground. As the van wound its way through back alleys, avoiding checkpoints, Amara's mind whirled with possibilities. They had the truth on their side, but their opponents had raw power and weren't afraid to use it. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a fight for the very soul of their city. Looking around at the determined faces of her companions, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. They'd been knocked down, but they weren't defeated. Not yet. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. Let's take our city back. As the van disappeared into the gathering dusk, Amara knew they were racing against time. The corrupt officials would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. But with the truth as their weapon and the people as their allies, Amara and her team had a fighting chance. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of the entire city hung in the balance. Whatever came next, Amara was ready to face it head-on, fueled by an unshakable belief in justice and the power of the truth to overcome even the darkest corruption. The abandoned warehouse buzzed with nervous energy as Amara addressed the diverse group gathered before her. Community leaders, whistleblowing officers, and determined citizens hung on her every word. For weeks, they'd worked tirelessly, building a network of resistance and gathering irrefutable evidence of the corruption plaguing their city. Tonight, Amara said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach, we take back our city. The plan was audacious. While Carlos and his tech-savvy team prepared to hijack the emergency broadcast system, others would stage peaceful protests at key locations, drawing attention and resources. Meanwhile, Amara, Marcus, and a small team would make their way to City Hall, where a late-night emergency session was being held. As they moved through the darkened streets, Amara couldn't shake a feeling of déjà vu. Once again, she found herself heading into danger, fighting for justice. But this time, she wasn't alone. The whole city was behind her. Sirens wailed in the distance as they approached City Hall. Right on schedule, Carlos's voice crackled over every radio and TV in the city, revealing the truth about the corruption and calling citizens to action. Amara and her team slipped into the building through a service entrance, guided by an insider. As they neared the main chamber, raised voices echoed down the corridor. We have to contain this. The mayor's panicked tone carried clearly. If this gets out. It's already out, Amara said, pushing open the doors. A dozen startled faces turned toward her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then chows erupted. The mayor lunged for a phone, while others made a break for the exits. But Amara's team was ready, locking the doors as Marcus began live-streaming the scene to millions of viewers. "It's over," Amara declared, her voice ringing with authority. "We have everything. The bribes, the cover-ups, the orders to target innocent citizens. The whole world is watching." The fight seemed to drain out of the room's occupants as realization set in. Outside, the sounds of gathering crowds grew louder. Just then, Sarah burst in, slightly out of breath. "Federal agents are on their way," she announced. "And you're going to want to see this." She handed Amara a file. As she scanned its contents, Amara's eyes widened. It was a detailed confession from the police commissioner, implicating not just local officials, but pointing to a broader network of corruption extending to state and even federal levels. Amara locked eyes with the mayor, seeing the defeat in his slumped shoulders. "You have a choice," she said quietly. "Cooperate now, help us root out every last piece of this rot, or go down fighting and face the full consequences." For a tense moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then, slowly, the mayor nodded. As federal agents swarmed the building and jubilant crowds filled the streets, Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. They'd done it. Justice would be served. But their victory celebration was short-lived. As Amara stepped outside to address the waiting media, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A figure broke through, running full tilt toward the steps. Time seemed to slow as Amara recognized Officer Briggs, the man she'd thought dead in the courtroom. His eyes were wild, his intention clear as he raised a gun. "This isn't over," he screamed. Multiple things happened at once. Sarah tackled Amara, shielding her with her body. Marcus dove for Briggs, and from somewhere in the crowd, a single shot rang out. Briggs crumpled to the ground, the gun clattering away unfired. As the dust settled, a familiar face emerged from the stunned onlookers. That hotel clerk from that fateful night, trembling as he lowered a small pistol. I couldn't let him hurt you," the clerk stammered. "Not after everything you've done for us." As paramedics rushed to attend to Briggs, Amara helped Sarah to her feet, her mind reeling. The clerk's intervention was a stark reminder of how their fight for justice had touched so many lives. In the days that followed, the full scope of their victory became clear. Corrupt officials were ousted, sweeping reforms were implemented, and a new era of transparency dawned for the city. Amara found herself at the forefront of this change, working tirelessly to ensure the hard-won reforms took root. But even as she celebrated their success, Amara knew the fight was far from over. The commissioner's confession had opened a Pandora's box, revealing tendrils of corruption reaching far beyond their city limits. As she stood at her office window, watching the sun rise over a city reborn, Amara felt a familiar fire ignite within her. This victory was just the beginning. There were more battles to be fought, more injustices to be righted. With a determined smile, she turned back to her desk, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but with the truth as her guide and the people by her side, Amara knew that real, lasting change was possible. The story of one woman's stand against injustice had blossomed into a movement, igniting hope and inspiring action across the nation. And for Amara Johnson, this was just the first chapter in a lifelong fight for equality and justice for all. In the weeks following the dramatic events at City Hall, Amara found herself at the center of a whirlwind of change. The city was undergoing a profound transformation, and she was determined to see it through. The first order of business was ensuring that justice was served. Amara worked closely with federal prosecutors, providing testimony and evidence that led to the conviction of dozens of corrupt officials, including the former mayor and police commissioner. It was a grueling process, but with each guilty verdict, Amara felt a sense of vindication for all those who had suffered under the corrupt system. Officer Briggs, who had survived his wounds, became a key witness in exchange for leniency. His testimony shed light on the intricate web of corruption, leading investigators to uncover similar patterns in neighboring cities. What had started as a local fight for justice was rapidly expanding into a regional and potentially national movement for police reform and government accountability. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen was promoted to lead a new internal affairs division, tasked with rooting out any remaining corruption within the police force. Her first act was to implement a series of rigorous new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and racial sensitivity. Marcus, energized by their victory, threw himself into drafting legislation aimed at preventing similar abuses of power in the future. His proposed Transparency and Accountability Act quickly gained traction, with lawmakers from both parties recognizing the need for systemic change. As for Amara, she found herself thrust into a new role as a public figure and advocate for justice. Speaking engagements and interviews filled her calendar as people across the country sought her insight on combating institutional racism and corruption. It was exhausting work, but Amara embraced it, knowing that her words had the power to inspire change. One sunny afternoon, as Amara was leaving a community meeting, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was the hotel clerk who had saved her life on the steps of City Hall. She approached him with a warm smile. "I never got the chance to properly thank you," Amara said, extending her hand. The clerk, looking slightly embarrassed, shook her hand. "I should be thanking you, Ms. Johnson. What you did, it gave people like me hope. Made us believe we could stand up and make a difference." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carlos, who had become an invaluable ally in the ongoing fight for reform. "Amara, you're not going to believe this," he said, excitement evident in his voice. "Remember those files we couldn't crack? Well, we finally got through the encryption." The files in question were part of a trove of digital evidence they had recovered during the investigation. Most had been easily accessible, but a few heavily encrypted documents had resisted all attempts at decryption. Until now. Back at their makeshift headquarters, Amara, Marcus, and Sarah huddled around Carlos's computer as he pulled up the decrypted files. What they saw left them stunned. "This goes way beyond our city," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the documents. "These are records of a nationwide network, coordinating similar corrupt practices across multiple states." Amara felt a familiar mix of dread and determination settle in her stomach. They had won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. This new information pointed to a level of systemic corruption that was almost too vast to comprehend. As they discussed their next steps, a news alert flashed across Carlos's screen. The governor was holding an emergency press conference. They turned up the volume just in time to hear a bombshell announcement. "In light of recent events and ongoing federal investigations, I am hereby announcing the formation of a special task force to investigate allegations of widespread corruption within our state's law enforcement and governmental bodies," the governor declared. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and disbelieving laughter. Their local victory had sparked a statewide reckoning. In the days that followed, Amara found herself working closely with the newly formed task force, sharing their evidence and insights. It was clear that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, it felt like real, lasting change was within reach. One evening, as Amara was preparing to leave the office, she received an unexpected visitor. It was her mother, carrying a small potted plant. "I thought your new office could use a little life," she said, setting the plant on Amara's desk. Then, with tears in her eyes, she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. So proud and so scared for you." Amara hugged her back, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I know, Mom, but this is important. What we're doing here, it's bigger than just me." As they parted, Amara's mother held her at arm's length, studying her face. "You look tired, honey. Are you taking care of yourself?" The question gave Amara pause. In the whirlwind of the past few months, she had barely taken a moment to breathe, let alone reflect on her own well-being. That night, as she finally returned to her apartment, Amara took a long look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked older, wearier, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had changed, and so had the world around her. Amara thought back to that night in the hotel room, when two officers had tried to intimidate her. How different things might have been if she had stayed silent, if she had let fear win. Instead, she had chosen to fight, and that choice had set off a chain reaction that was still reverberating across the country. As she got ready for bed, Amara's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Turn on the news," it read. She flipped on the TV just in time to see a breaking news alert. In a city halfway across the country, protesters were filling the streets, demanding investigations into their local police department. Signs in the crowd bore slogans like "Justice for All" and "No More Corruption," and there, Front and center was a familiar phrase that made Amara's heart swell. Be the change. It was a phrase she had used in one of her recent speeches, a call to action for everyday citizens to stand up against injustice. Seeing it echoed back from across the country was a powerful reminder of the impact their fight was having. As she drifted off to sleep, Amara felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. A movement had been born, and it was growing stronger every day. The next morning, Amara woke with renewed energy and purpose. As she got ready for another day of fighting for justice, she paused to water the plant her mother had brought. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her of the importance of nurturing not just the cause, but herself and those around her. Stepping out into the morning sunlight, Amara took a deep breath, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, but with each passing day, the world was becoming a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. And for Amara Johnson, that made all the difference in the world. As she walked toward her office, people on the street called out greetings and words of encouragement. Amara smiled and waved back, feeling the strength of her community behind her. She may have started this journey alone in a hotel room, facing down injustice, but now she stood at the forefront of a movement, surrounded by allies and supporters. The story of Amara Johnson, the lawyer who took on systemic racism and corruption, was far from over. But with each step forward, she was writing a new chapter, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice and dared to stand up and say, "No more." And so, with her head held high and her heart full of determination, Amara walked on, ready to face whatever the future might hold, knowing that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope for a better tomorrow.